Hello, everyone. This is the 125th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interviewed Dr. Alexander Jackson as we discuss English football in the interwar years of the 1920s and 1930s. Dr. Jackson is an independent researcher, author, writer, and a curator at the National Football Museum. Mr. Jackson is the author of Football's Great War, Association Football on the English Home Front, 1914 to 1918. Mr. Jackson was on our podcast almost 4 years ago discussing football during the First World War. Hello, Alex. Welcome back after so many years.
I'd say it's a real pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
Can you describe the state of football in England at the end of the Great War in 1918?
Yes, sort of like building on from when we were discussing it when you had me on the show before. As some people sometimes think there wasn't any football happening during the First World War, but as I kind of sort of discussed, that's a bit of a misconception. There's a lot of controversy around the 1914-15 professional season, but after the FA bans professionalism, that is the payment of players, the game still goes on. So when the war comes to an end in November, or rather the armistice comes in 1918, the war doesn't officially end until 1919. There is actually a football season going ahead. It's the 1918-1919 wartime season. And so that continues in its format because obviously people don't know quite how like the peace process will pan out. And so you have these regional leagues across the Lancashire, across the Midlands and around London, where most of the sort of top professional teams are still continuing to play, but with players playing under amateur conditions. So when the war comes to an end, these football games are still going on and they're actually sites for sort of celebrations. So when the armistice, I think if I can remember correctly, is on a Tuesday of the week. So a few days later, it's the Saturday fixtures. So you have bigger crowds already. People are starting to come back because they feel more happy about going to watch games. It's a place to come together to celebrate in a public space. You have at one particular ground, some people getting over enthusiastic and they start letting off fireworks, which apparently are a little bit of a challenge, especially when some of them start veering off and heading towards the band who are there to play as well. But you just get this sort of really sort of celebratory atmosphere where like in one game it's described as just being one continuous roar of the crowd of cheering all the way through. Although I think that helped because I think it was a 4-4 draw, so there was plenty to cheer in that game. And so that's at the point when they sort of start making those first tentative steps into what is peacetime football going to look like? Is it going to be something new and different, or is it going to be how much of it is about setting the clock back to 1914 and picking up those pre-war strands?
What was the place of football in culture and society at this point, and had the war affected this status in any way?
By the start of the war, football's moved from being, in quite rough terms, being the association football, has moved from being the sport of a small number of a sort of elite ex-public school boys, where it's played as an amateur pastime, to the mass commercial sort of spectator sport with also a grassroots sport connected with it as well. And that's on the eve of the First World War. And we have by then like the kind of modern football system of football leagues, the English Football League particularly being very popular, and famous clubs like we know today, like Manchester United, Chelsea, Newcastle, are playing in stadia like St James's Park, Old Trafford, Stamford Bridge. And so that commercial game then comes under quite a bit of criticism in the 1914-15 season for continuing whilst the war's going on. So football has a place in society. It's very popular. It's not as quite sort of socially prestigious as, say, cricket is amongst the middle classes, or horse racing is amongst the upper classes. So the game's sort of wider standing does take a hit amongst those kind of sections of society who have sort of some pre-war hostility towards the commercialization of the game. And you see this particularly in the post-war and the interwar period, in this continuing trend of public and grammar schools moving away from offering football to the boys who are playing in favor exclusively only of rugby. And you get this kind of like shift to rugby that becomes quite pronounced, and especially going post World War II, where if you go to certain types of schools, you were going to be more working class in playing football. And if you go through these other ones, you play rugby, and it's rugby that signifies that you're like a probably sort of established member of the British establishment of the upper classes or middle classes. And so the war does have that quite big impact, sort of over long term, about a key section of young people in British society in terms of those coming from very affluent backgrounds being steered away from association football. But more generally, it keeps on growing. It still recovers. It's still seen as having, amongst those who support the playing of football in the war, it's still seen as having a positive effect. And so the game's growth isn't really hampered in more general terms. It, in fact, enjoys a post-war boom.
Since there would have been a return to normalcy, what were the steps into transitioning football and especially league football back into society?
So what you have across 1918, 1919 season is that because the armistices come in partway through the season, there's a sort of sensible decision just to keep on going for that season, not to change it drastically in terms of trying to restart organizations. So throughout that kind of almost like forgotten season, it continues as it was under wartime, with the main exception is that after a little while, they reintroduce limited payments of players of about £2 a match, whereas before in the war, they weren't being paid anything. And so that's a first tentative step. It doesn't come very easily. Some of the football authorities are very sort of opposed to it, but the players are saying, like, we made all these wartime sacrifices. It's costing us money to go to games. You're still getting crowds. You're still getting money through the gate. Some clubs are still making a profit. Why is it not? It's not fair to not share that money with us to at least allow us to cover some of those costs. So that is introduced, but again with some opposition, which is quite interesting. And then the struggle, the big thing for the player, also for the clubs, is they needing to get their players back from the forces, because a lot of them are serving in the British Armed Forces, and not just closer to hand in like Central Europe, but further afield in the Middle East, even India, Africa. So it takes quite a while for those players to be demobilized and brought back. And again, that's quite interesting because the demobilization process there's politics within that about who gets released. And at one point, it was about whether employers could make a case for vital employees coming back to help them out with their businesses. So some people are suggesting like, well, clubs can make a case for their players to come back because they're vital to them. And other people are going like, maybe not as important as people working in factories or in mines to like the national economy to bring a footballer back. Although I think Tim Coleman, who was a bit of a noted comedian, so to speak, he was serving in the army at that time. And so when he came to his demobilization process to ask what his former occupation was, he put down like a childhood occupation that he had working on a farm, because if you're in those kind of industries, you can potentially come back. I think then they followed up to say, exactly when did you last do this? And he sort of like was a bit like, oh, maybe a little bit a while back. So at that point, they were like, no, you're a footballer, not so much like, a farm worker. But some players are still coming back well into the summer and also into later of like 1919. So when the clubs are putting their squads together, there's a little bit of like waiting to see when so and so is turning up and also in what condition. And so some of the quite poignant stories around that, well, obviously you've got players coming back there's two both connected with Sunderland. They had a guy called Tom Wilson, who'd injured himself serving in the armed forces, and Jimmy Seed, who also a same reserve team player alongside Wilson, and he'd been gassed twice. And so both of them come back, play games in like the summer of during the 1919 period before the season fully restarts in 1919-20. And both of them play sort of in friendly games, and they're not very fit or they're out of form. And in both cases, the directors take one or just a couple of looks at them and go, nah, you're not going to be able to cut it, and give them free transfers. So these guys who have joined up as quite young men, served in the armed forces voluntarily, they come back and they're not getting that kind of land fit for heroes as was promised at the time. And so they end up on the football scrap heap. But we know about them because they actually managed to resurrect their careers and go on to success later on, which we might then come back to. But it is quite poignant that, it's a big challenge, understandably, for clubs to try and work out who's worthy of a contract. But it does lead to some quite sort of, even by football industry's terms, quite brutal sort of decisions on about who will make the cut and come back into it. But in essence, they go back to the pre-war setup more or less. Back to the 1919-20 season kicks off in September or August, September, kind of along the same lines as before. They try to pick up as many threads. So there's no particular major changes to the structure at that point, particularly. Well, I should say they expand the league slightly to get out of the issues of the fact that of the match fixing scandal involving Manchester United and Liverpool, where they fix a game that helps gets Manchester United out of a relegation battle. And so at the end of the war, to avoid all issues of relegating people or not relegating, they promote extra teams up, which leads, I think if I remember correctly, this is the scenario in which Arsenal gets promoted into the Football League. Barnsley finished second, but Arsenal make a bit in the second division pre-war. Arsenal finish below them in the table, but they make a better case. There's allegations of bribery around this as well, and they get selected to go up into an expanded first division. And it took until I think 1999 for Barnsley to get promoted to the top flight, and Arsenal haven't left it since then. So when you start looking at different places, there are these very sort of interesting, very long echoes of the war in terms of club histories and the impact it's had.
Geographically, where were the hotbeds of football at this point?
You've got a very sort of strong spread in, if we're talking sort of professional football across the country, there's the traditional heartlands still of like the Northwest, the Northeast, Yorkshire and the Midlands. But you also got a large number of professional teams or semi-professional teams in areas like South Wales and the valleys there. Quite a number of those teams have been playing in the Southern League prior to the First World War, and also across the southern coast and around London. So what you have is quite a broad spread. The more successful ones at the top levels tend to be still these traditional sides from the north of England, with one or two southern sides coming through. But what you get in the 20s is an expansion of the Football League with a lot of these southern sides who hadn't played regularly against northern teams in a league format. The Football League is expanded to 4 divisions, and it has a first, second, and then third south, third north, to allow a certain amount of reflecting the economics. If you've got a smaller team, long distance travel is expensive. So those teams, mainly in the south and the north, at the lower level, they play against each other with the hope of getting promoted into the second division. Although it is quite challenging because only the winners used to go up. Whereas today we have a lot of teams moving between the divisions. It's quite fluid. It was quite static in those days, even throughout that, where you literally had to win the league to get promoted out of the third division or the north or south. So some teams are still playing regional football against each other for quite sustained periods of time.
In terms of the football press, was it restricted to newspapers, or would there have been specialized football magazines at this point?
The newspapers sort of remain sort of like the key main ways of getting sports coverage. Your classic being your Saturday sports specials that get published very quickly after a match, and there's lots of national news coverage. But you do see an expansion in football magazines. They sort of build on a little bit of the boys' story newspapers from the pre-war period, but in the early 20s there's a definite boom in the popularity of the sport, and so that's linked to then consumer products. So you have papers like the Football and Sports Favourite. I'm trying to think, All Sports Weekly, and so they are magazine style coverage. Maybe not like they're paper formats and not the glossy magazine print that we're used to, but they have heavy focus on photographs, articles, interviews with players, fictional stories as well. So there's a link to the boys' stories from the pre-war, which also continue. And in some ways, we've probably perhaps used to thinking of that more of as like a post-Second World War creation in terms of magazine coverage, but it's definitely there in the 20s and through the 30s. And so they offer an insights into players' lives, lifestyles, opinions. They make them sort of appear as personalities as well as players. Some of that is a struggle because some of that drops off with the depression effect, I think, affecting like the market to sell those kind of magazines. So some of them sort of drop out by the 30s, but some of them also keep going. And then also crucially, you have Topical Times and Thompson's Weekly News, which are 2 sort of weekly Saturday newspaper magazine style. And in their sports coverage, they have a regular bit of interviews with players, but crucially in the summer months of serialized autobiographies, often like connected to like the cup winning side, like the captain or a key player. And again, these are offering more insights and what it's like to be a player within the confines of sort of a kind of sort of as a type of newspaper, of a type of like writing. They already have their conventions. They tend to stay away from certain types of topics or not go into detail. And they're obviously a limited length because they run for like, say, 2.5 months, maybe like 10, somewhere between 8 or 10 episodes almost. But they do start offering a bit where players are again appearing as personalities and you're getting to hear their life story, which is quite interesting.
What was the status of the FA Cup in this post-war decade? any differences from the pre-war days?
It's still the premier English football competition, and so it still sort of holds that place in the sort of within the game. But also more broadly, it's continuing that trend that's starting to appear in 1914, where the king goes to the first time to the FA Cup final, and that process of that sort of linkage between the monarchy and the royal seal of approval of this being like something that the king goes to alongside going to the horse racing, going to other major events, it kind of seals its sort of like its approval, its place in the national life. And then that's also reinforced by the fact that from 1923 onwards, it's held at Wembley, it's held at the same place. It has a little bit of a sort of re-establish, not establish itself between after the war and up until 22, it's held at Stamford Bridge. So still in London, but a club ground. And so it's sort of it's still part of that sort of the war, trying to find its place. But with Wembley, and also then the added addition of things like community singing in particular, it starts bringing all these different bits of Englishness together that then become over the years FA Cup tradition. Some of these things start in the 20s, but they last on, we still have, or rather it went in and out of having the Abide With Me being sung before as like a sort of a key sort of song. And it links these things into wider sort of ideas or concept of English identity, like, church going, church songs, in that sense, with that kind of those links. And obviously, you also have the massive crowds that come to the 23 White Horse final, which is the last of the old style, turn up and pay on the day. And because of that, you get this huge crowd of over 200,000 people. You have these issues where the gates are kind of swarmed in a way that would happen at some like big games in the Edwardian era. And obviously, what they take from that is that it has to be all ticketed. So the actual crowd drops to a standardized sort of like 90 odd thousand, and you don't get the 100,000 plus crowds that you got at some Edwardian Cup finals, or that you also get crucially at Hampden, which then becomes the site of world mega crowds in the 30s, where you have crowds of over 130,000 for some England, Scotland internationals. Wembley is sort of capped at this safer sort of size, which kind of gives it some of its sort of again, it's sort of like feel of tradition. And it becomes just part of the whole ritual continues of like fans saving up and going down for cup final. Although bringing in ticketing adds in a new element to that experience of like ritualization, because it's like getting hold of a ticket. How do you do that? The pricing around that and things like that. So it's always adapting slightly a little bit within that.
Was the significance of the move to Wembley self-evident, as in a way this stadium has become synonymous with this cup and taken a mythical place as a result?
I think it develops over time. I think it's also one of those interesting things that how we remember it. It's the Empire Stadium at Wembley. That's something also I try to remind myself, because the stadium isn't built for a sporting event in itself. It's built in, comes in out of a wider exhibition around the British Empire and its links to different parts of the world to advertise and to kind of popularize empire at a time when the British government was trying to make the case for investment and get people to think about empire in positive terms. But then and that kind of bit of its sort of longer colonial legacy to the area, the site, is sometimes lost and forgotten. But if you look at programs, I think up until the 70s, at the bottom it still is Empire Stadium, Wembley, as opposed to Wembley Stadium, and that's a later change. For anyone who's aficionado of programs, got a few at home, want to have a look at them. What's kind of really important there and seeding the 23 one is that presence of the king. It's at the time it's kind of seen as reinforcing this idea of like the value. Again, the newspapers try to reinforce the value of monarchy. He's seen as having this calming influence on the crowd. That's where they've got the issues of trying to get them off the field. And then you kind of see that repeated over at different times. So it's referenced when then the king dies later on. I think it's the 30s. And again, like that's built up with those iconic images at the time. If you look at it from a different way, it's very interesting because it was like very close to like could have been quite easily a crowd disaster. The number of injuries at the event sometimes get forgotten, but they had like, I think probably trying to remember if it's like 70 plus like people like injured with crush style injuries, like other people with like lighter wounds, so to speak. So it's very interesting how, in very British terms, like something that's potential disaster then turned into this kind of heartwarming sort of story of that's quite soft and safe, so to speak. So it's very interesting to see how over time these different strands emerge and what people look back on as well.
Internationally, the war had an effect. Can you discuss the underlying reasons for FA's dispute with FIFA stemming from the war?
Yes, in the across the interwar period, England and the other home nations left FIFA twice. They left them firstly in 1920, and that's you can kind of situate that as part of wider sort of like disputes, differing opinions between those nations that had fought against the Allies who had fought against the Central Powers during the First World War. So that's countries like England, but also like sorry, countries like Britain, but also France and Belgium in terms of how the defeated Central Powers of Germany, Austria, and Hungary were going to be treated within the footballing community. So I think some of the more neutral powers were like, well, they can be potentially brought back in, we're willing to play them. And for their home nations and France and Belgium, obviously, they fought this war, they've lost a lot of men and women in this war, they've lost and this is not just like in broad person, this is like administrators, players, they have lost people in this war. And so amongst the administrators, there's a feeling that the Central Power should not be allowed to play. And then there's a very particular, if I remember correctly, it's quite a hardline stance that the home nations want. They want it not just to be that we're not playing Germany, but we will also refuse to play other countries that have played Germany. So even if you decide to go a different way, we're not going to play you. And because of this sort of very hostile mood, which kind of fits within the broader, framework of like the Treaty of Versailles, the idea of reparations, defeated powers paying for the costs of this war that they're being felt to have caused. The home nations withdraw from that. They come back in 1924, but then they leave 4 years later in 1928. And then this is around a different, more narrow sporting topic, which is the disagreements over the issue of how to define amoritism and whether you can allow broken time payments. That's payments to cover people's time off work to go and play in matches or tournaments. And so the British have a very sort of particular sense of this, very particular strong amateur pro divide. And essentially sort of other FIFA member states, they're not quite as hung up on this as the Brits, really, to be honest. Brits decide that's the hill they're going to die on for a period and then they leave FIFA. But it's also, I think, again, sort of this sense of, and we'll probably discuss it later, of British sort of superiority, the fact that it's their game that they've given to other people, and it means that they know it better than other people. And if other people are going to do it in different ways that they don't agree with, that's fine. But they're not that fussed about being part of the broader club. They've got their own club already, kind of, to put it so to speak. It does create an initial sort of, from at first glance, a very sort of view of Britain being quite insular in terms of football in this period, but not entirely the case. But we'll probably discuss that a little bit later.
Did the public and the press rush back to the game after the war, or had the war affected it in any way? I mean, in terms of the enthusiasm.
In terms of the enthusiasm, as soon as the war is over, you can see the crowds literally across that season sort of rising. And then you get this big post-war boom of like the early 20s. And you see it even during the war, sports commentators are talking about in terms of like, you can see that we can imagine there'll be this rush. People are being forced not to engage with leisure, whether by military service or service in factories. And they're proved true. As soon as the war is over, people feel more comfortable about it and they've got more time, especially more money in terms of that, some of that post-war boom. The crowds continue a post-war trend, but they are very noticeable. So you get in the start, the 1919-20 season, you get huge crowds turning up to like league games. It's very popular. Sometimes like people are forcing their way in, gates getting knocked down. And that continues up until a point where the depression hits. And then it's, again, wider economics. Crowds, to a certain degree, are impacted that, especially in areas which are more heavily affected by the depression, like the north of England. And then across the 30s, crowds are starting to go back up as the economic position increases. It gets better in sort of more general terms. But yeah, it's quite interesting. There's this general sort of idea that there's this growing enthusiasm for sport, and it's reflected in things like also like the national newspapers getting more sports reporting in favor of boring topics because there's this demand for it and it's driving consumption, not just in spectatorship but in consumer goods and associated press reports.
At what point would you say football was back to full functioning like the pre-war years?
I would probably say relatively quickly in terms of because they kind of went they tried to just go back to where they were before. So we weren't trying to do major restructuring immediately. So from the 1920 season onwards, it's kind of got that set up. Within the first couple of seasons, the Football League expands, so that kind of structure changes slightly, but in essence, it's the teams are playing like continue to play in leagues, they're still playing, getting big crowds. And they've sort of reintroduced they amend things like the maximum wage, but only slightly to take into account like wartime inflation. But in essence, throughout this period, players are still confined within the maximum wage. So they're not sort of big change, radical changes that are going on. So pretty much I would say almost like within that 1920 season onwards, yeah, it's sort of back to normal inverted commas, so to speak.
In addition to newspapers, I imagine radio also became an avenue for football information. Can you describe its influence and evolution in the 1920s, 30s?
Yes, so it starts coming through in the 20s, and by the 30s, it's become a sort of relatively established, matter of fact, part of the broader media landscape of football. It's a bit tricky in terms of understanding, sort of, and I have to confess, I haven't seen some of the latest research around here because there's always that challenge with media. You can work out sometimes what it reaches in terms of how many people are listening, where it's been broadcast from. Understanding how people engage with it, what place it had in their lives is the trickier bit because that's like a thousand myriad details of how people live their lives and how they engage with it. One of my favorite little discoveries when I was doing research a bit back in the day was one of the first broadcasts in something. This is about 20, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, 26 or 27. Newcastle United played the Corinthians, who are a famous amateur team, but who were taking part in the FA Cup. And so they played, it was a big cup tie, played down in London, and the Corinthians took a goal lead. So it's a bit of a classic cup upset on the cards, and Newcastle came back to win 3-1. And so one of the Newcastle papers did a cartoon of their cartoonist listening to the match. So you've got this big gramophone, what almost looks like a big gramophone record with the large, like sort of like earpiece for the sound to come out. And the cartoon is brilliant because it's not showing you all the players playing. It shows you the cartoonist reacting to the sports commentary. And what's lovely about it is probably the kind of same experiences and emotions that we all feel when listening to a match via the radio. It's as much the terror as much as our mind when the opposition are coming towards the goal, and so you can see him like fretting as like the Corinthians going up, and the commentator going, "Oh, they've scored." He's going, "Shut up! No, don't say that." And then it moves to like joy and exhilaration as Newcastle win. But it's also lovely because the sports commentator who's doing that was George Allison, who later on then went on to become manager of Arsenal after Herbert Chapman. And his catchphrase or nickname was "By Jove, Allison," because that was what he used to say when he get very excited. Like, "By Jove, they scored!" Or "That's an exciting piece of play." And in that cartoon, you can actually see "By Jove" gets mentioned like I think at least once, maybe twice. And it's interesting that the cartoonist in that very early stage is already starting to pick out those phrases that make sports commentators like, personalities to us as the listeners. Because I'm sure we've all got the different traits that we like or dislike about different commentators, whether it's radio or TV. So that started emerging in that period. You would have restrictions on how much of the match you would hear. So I think, if I'm getting it right, still would be like, say, the second half to avoid putting people staying at home and not going to the match. That was always a big concern for the football, especially the Football League. And that's why we still have the 3 p.m. broadcast ban with English football. To again, and that's a legacy of that, going back to when TV's introduced later on. So it comes part of that fabric of like something you can tune into for those who couldn't go to games, being able to listen and being part of a sort of a shared community of listeners. Or so it builds on that same effect that newspapers have started to build up in the 19th century, but just obviously through more modern formats.
Who were the standout stars of the game in this post-war era? And in general, how was the status of the stars different from pre-war days?
If I go with the second part, the status changes a little bit, but it also remains fairly consistent. The thing that keeps it relatively consistent is wages. So players are still like their pre-war counterparts. and their counterparts after the end of the Second World War, restricted by the maximum wage. So their earnings, their lifestyles cannot change in the way that they obviously started changing in the 70s, 80s, and obviously to the modern day, where the top elite players can earn huge amounts equivalent to movie stars. Back then, movie stars could earn very large amounts of money, or musical stars. Footballers could have the same kind of appeal to people, but they couldn't earn the same money. At the same time, you've got this growth, I think, of like media interest in them in terms of like wanting to know about their personal lives. So that's growing. Maybe not, definitely not in the same way at the level of, say, like Hollywood stars, where, you know, there's a huge associated like media coverage that's like off the scale in some ways. But they are becoming more notable and expanding. So like not just like at regional level. In terms of like some of the standout stars, I think it's always interesting like who's a star at the time and whose stardom lasts beyond a period that then gets remembered, like say 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later. So it's quite interesting. If we ask that question to people at the time, they might pick out different players that I or other people may not pick out at the time. So I just tried to like jot down a few different ones. I think it's in terms of stardom, a quite interesting one in the early 20s is a player called Jack Cock. So he actually was playing pre-First World War, he was playing for Huddersfield, and he moved to Chelsea after the First World War. And he's really interesting because he was very handsome, he was a bit of a singer. And so during his playing career, he was at Chelsea and then Plymouth. I think trying to remember maybe at Millwall briefly. But he actually appeared, he endorsed goods like toys and games. We've got some in the collection. And he also appeared in one or two films. I think he appeared in a silent film and then later in a talkie film. And so there's a scene put in so you can hear him standing at a piano singing, showing off his singing voice that he would have. And he's quite interesting because that's quite a modern thing in some ways, but quite rare. You don't get obviously those kind of movie appearances by the players too much later on. Although having said that, you do have the Arsenal Stadium mystery in the late 30s, which does feature some of the Arsenal side, which is almost like a bit of a promo vehicle for Arsenal as a football club within a film setting. But Jack Cork is a really interesting character because he's like this sort of debonair guy. In one FA Cup semi-final, he comes up against someone who's at the opposite end of the sort of the stardom style playing style, because Jack Cock was a very skillful footballer, played up front, and he came up against Aston Villa's, this would be about 1920, 21, Aston Villa's Frank Barson, who was from sort of South Yorkshire, Sheffield area, and he was possibly one of the hardest of all the hard men in English football. He's a man who, I think if I remember correctly, reputedly sent off in his own testimonial game, which probably gives you an idea of sort of like how aggressive he took the game. He was a very skillful player, very talented. He moved between different clubs for large amounts of money, but he was also a man who would managed to get sent off. I think he had quite a number of sending offs during his career. So that's an example of how you could be a star if for sort of like slightly more pragmatic football reasons of like he's a great player, but he's also really like a tough man on the field. And that's I think sort of like there's different elements of it. But another player that I'd probably pick out as an interesting sort of star, again, in terms of lifestyle, the story is a player who went to my club, the club I support, Newcastle United, and that's Hughie Gallagher. And he was one of the top goal scorers of the interwar period.
Wembley
He was
Wizard.
he he was one of the Wembley Wizards. Funnily enough, he actually didn't score as one of the Wembley Wizards. I think it's one of the Scottish forward line that didn't score, but he was very skillful. I think what they call like a Tannenball. I can never pronounce it properly because I'm not Scottish. Tannenbar players who grew up playing with the small little rubber balls. And so he came from up in Scotland, came down to Newcastle, and he sort of set goal in the era just after the change in the offside law. And he was a contemporary of Dixie Dean. And he said when he arrived at Newcastle, he was scoring at sort of like Haaland rate, shall we say, of like twos and threes and that kind of stuff. And so he took Newcastle to their last ever Football League title. And then they controversially sold him because he fell out a bit with the club and they sold him to Chelsea. And when he came back, I think was still Newcastle United's, or at that point, attendance record for a midweek game, because Huey was coming back because he was that big a star, which is like one way of measuring like stardom. But he was very famous as sort of being a player that sort of got into bits of trouble. He was sort of at Chelsea as sort of like a bit free rein to sort of do as his will, so to speak. And also very interestingly, and this is again like this, he had his life away from football was also commentated on a little bit because he actually got divorced, which was actually very expensive and quite hard for working class people to do in that period. It's the kind of thing obviously today would attract very different types of attention. And he also got into trouble famously. This is some of this stuff probably came out afterwards, but he famously got into as recounted, I think, in by some of the biographers, he got into a fight with his future brother-in-law in Newcastle because they found out technically he was still married back in Scotland. And sort of he'd married young, the marriage hadn't quite worked out. And then when he was caught in Newcastle, he hadn't quite mentioned this fact. So apparently his future brother-in-law was not too impressed, and they are reputed to have been bound over to keep the peace after being caught disagreeing with it, shall we say, in the streets of Newcastle. And so he's sort of an interesting example of sort of the private lives that players had in this era, a wave that now would attract huge amounts of attention, and back then would have not necessarily didn't quite attract newspaper coverage and media coverage in the same way. But it's quite interesting seeing these differences across time and the sort of how stardom relates to personality as well. That I could go on sort of like many other different players of sort of that era, like Harry Hibbs at Birmingham was like one of the star goalkeepers that period. And obviously the number of different players who played at Arsenal, like Alex James, Cliff Baston, Eddie Hapgood, and also my namesake, Alec Jackson of Huddersfield Town. Yeah. So it's those ones where they have a period. It's always fascinating when you delve down into it. There are so many different stars you could pick out in different ways and different names. One of my other favourite ones, just for a name, is Pongo Waring, who played for Aston Villa. And again, he was a bit of a character as well, an interesting one player.
Getting back to the international game, in the 1920s, to a lesser extent in the 1930s, England and the other home nations were content with the annual matches amongst themselves, with the odd match against a continental side here and there. Was this because of British football's insularity, or was this due to the lingering dispute with FIFA?
Probably a combination of both to a degree. They're quite happy like seeing the home championship as like the main international tournament for those countries. Obviously, takes place across the year, so it's not too much time. There's always the continued tensions with getting your players released by club sides on a Saturday because they've got to play games as well. There's no separate weekends for international football at that time. The dispute with FIFA again also affects it. Yes. I think also in the 20s, also other European nations. This is the thing, I suppose, that one way to think about it as well is that other European nations are also developing their own sort of sides and the scale of their game. And so their ability to put sides together, to travel abroad, who they want to play, the money available for that, getting release of players, means that it's not just, I think, on Britain. And so you see in the early 20s, the England play sides, which they have those links with, in terms of inviting foreign teams across, it's France and Belgium to begin with. And obviously, you can see the connections, they're closest and they're our allies. And then it starts moving and developing. But obviously, it'll be impacted by the things. So England play Spain across the late 20s and early and about 30, but then you have the Spanish Civil War. So that's going to rule out further games with Spain, for example. And then also there's also politics because you've had actually the Irish War of Independence post the First World War. So Ireland splits into North and South. The South is the Irish Free State, and then that becomes later the Republic of Ireland. And there's a dispute there. And so what the home nations do, which England is part of, they don't play international games against the Irish Free State slash Republic of Ireland, and they encourage the nations not to do so, so to speak, because of those the fallout of that situation. So it's very interesting. You flip it out and look at like who the Republic of Ireland essentially played during the interwar period. They play other nations that are newly created, like say Hungary, out of the First World War politics, or other Catholic states, essentially, or state countries where Catholicism is quite a strong part of it. So countries like Italy and Spain. So it's interesting how international football is shaped by quite different strands of sort of politics and other wider cultural factors as well. But on the other hand, you can also make the argument that in a completely different way, the English football is less incident, well, I say in some ways, because it is willing to travel far big distances. So it doesn't go to the World Cup, but they do send teams to Canada, Australasia, and South Africa, which obviously connections of the Empire and the Commonwealth. So sometimes it depends how you sort of frame these questions about how far is your vision and in what terms. It's quite interesting, really.
The standout manager of this era is Herbert Chapman. First in the 1920s with Huddersfield Town, and then in the 1930s with Arsenal. Can you describe his importance to English football at this point?
He's sort of often credited as sort of being the first modern manager, although that might be, I think, is both true and in some ways also overstating it. So you have other secretary managers who come through in the pre-First World War who are important in sort of creating cultures at their club, signing, being involved in giving some ability to sign players. Tom Watson, for example, at Liverpool is seen as quite crucial in developing the first sort of successful Liverpool sides, although he still didn't have crucial control of certain things like team selection, I think. Herbert Chapman is the sort of the manager, almost like the credited can be seen as the template of the modern manager. Well, again, that what that is always changing, and so in some ways, he's closer to a Ferguson today than he is to say some of the head coaches that you have at like football clubs now, where again they divide all sorts of responsibilities amongst different people. He's sort of been, you can see him as the first time when sort of someone with football knowledge from within, especially as an ex-pro, being given that power to shape the direction of a club's sort of transfer strategy, the players that they're signing, to agree the tactics. But then also, especially when he was at Arsenal, the way he was able to shape the club physically in terms of the development of the stadium, his ability to use public relations like the renaming of the local tube station from like to Highbury, innovations like on the clock end, so you can see time going by. He was thinking in ways in a quite big, broad way that not many managers were able to do or were able to do and have the power to influence that. And so he's the kind of forerunner to those managers of the 60s and the 70s, like your Don Revie's, your Bill Shankly's, your Matt Busby's, who really create who are synonymous with a club. Like you can say a club and there's one man who's synonymous with it. He's the precursor of that and established Arsenal as one of the leading forces in English football. Because prior to that, they were essentially sort of mid-table-ish terms, like had no great track record of any success at all at the top flight. And he changed that in a way that endured as well, which is quite something.
So as you go from the 1920s into the 1930s, is football perceived differently in culture and society compared to the pre-war days?
I think it's sort of growing, it's ever growing more part of like the national sort of national consciousness, the framework of it, as a way to sometimes almost to like describe Englishness to people in terms of like you've got the routine of Saturday matches. You see the majority working class fans, but also middle class fans going to games. You see it in the development, and this is an interwar one. Gambling is it's very popular pre-First World War, but you get the development of the football pools in the interwar period. And so they become like almost like an everyday fact of life. Get up to, I think, about its peak, sort of like 1 in 3 or 4 people taking part. A lot of women, even if not going to games, are gambling on football through the pools. And you can see a tension in that where there's this, quite clearly a lot of people in society enjoy gambling, enjoy like this type of gambling, which is sort of low cost, low risk, involves football. Football is almost a backdrop to the gambling. And you see that clashing with some of the older attitudes amongst some of the Football League officials who come from what we call non-conformist religious backgrounds, the Methodists, for example, who are often teetotalers and opposed to gambling. And so you get what is quite entertainingly called the Pools War of 1936, when an attempt to sort of discourage this gambling around football, the Football League decided the way to kneecap it was to basically not tell people what the fixtures were. So then you couldn't pin coupons and people could bet on it. So for 2 weeks, they attempted to basically keep the fixtures secret. So as of a Saturday, sort of basically roughly idea, if we're like almost like a Friday or Saturday, sort of like find out roughly or like, that there's going to be a home fixture and who you might be playing kind of thing. And obviously, in some way, it sounds ludicrous and it is ludicrous and it didn't last for very long. But it was a huge, big thing. It was like huge, major news coverage. You got international things going out in the wider world, like, sort of thing like Italian invasion, Abyssinia. And then in Britain, it's like the Pools War is like, it's taking up lots of news coverage. And it does reflect that sort of these older officials are often to their 70s or older. They're almost trying to like stop the tide, so to speak. Well, not stop the tide, they're just sort of ever more becoming out of tune, so to speak, of where this type of place for football in English life has got to. But you also got a certain amount of sort of growing interest amongst women as well, or at least in terms of newspapers talking about spectator attendance as patterns, the presence of women, not just going with, say, like male relatives or boyfriends, husbands, but also going in groups of themselves. And you start to see sort of again, and that again, there's that being pre-First World War, very popular in the league's early days when women could get in for free. But this is obviously when they're paying to get in. So it's moving within this kind of framework, constraints of grounds not changing, clubs remaining quite stable, the league structure remaining quite stable, but sort of growing more and more just part of Englishness in a sort of a certain respectable way, I think.
And I imagine by the 1930s, there was a visible rise in the attendances in league and
Mm.
FA Cup matches.
Yes, you get I think some of the records for, at least until certain years, like some of the records for some clubs were set in the 30s for attendances. Often FA Cup ties where you get that greater interest, but you can see it again. You've got this continuous growth of people wanting to get to these big, especially these big games. The economy is recovering. You particularly got sort of grow it, strengthen the economy, especially sort of around the Midlands and the South, as you get new industries based around new consumer products. And it's quite interesting that sort of in the late 30s, you sort of see the rise. This isn't a big broader one, but it's around, you can start seeing certain London clubs are starting to do well. And so at the end of the late 30s in the first division, you have Charlton Athletic and Brentford both being quite near the top of the table. They both finished very strongly. And in some ways that can be seen as reflective a little bit of like this sort of growing sort of interest in the game just generally, and also within the South as well. But you also get booms in the crowd back up in the north as well, where there is even still issues around the longer term impact of the depression on sort of traditional heavy industries.
As we get into the 1930s, we have the ascent of the World Cup. First in Uruguay in 1930, and later in Italy in 1934 and France in 1938. Naturally, the home nations stay out of this because of their dispute with FIFA. But was this also a further reflection of the insularity of the British game?
It's an interesting one. I was thinking about this. I'll probably say both yes and no. And I think it's easy to be, this is a terrible joke, it's easy to be insular about British insularity because it's just worth reflecting that the fact that there's only four European nations that go to the first World Cup in Uruguay in 1930. So they're not the only people who are choosing not to take part. They get offered the chance. We got it in the FA minutes. There's like a 2-bit line that says like we've received the offer from Uruguay and decide to decline it. But understandably, they decline it like other sort of leading European nations, like say like Austria don't go, Hungary. It's a fair amount of time to travel there and then also be part of the tournament. So you've got big issues to be had, say, with like if you wanted to go, you'd have a big sort of discussion with clubs about what their plans were, player availability, cost, insurance. France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia are the sides who go in 1930, and they're not by any means the leading sides of Europe. So it's quite interesting from that perspective. I think where obviously the British or the English insularity is more obvious is in 34 and 38 because these are European World Cups and they've been shown that the tournament can take part. I think again it's the sort of it was going to take a bigger turnaround of worldviews by those leading officials at the FA, who again quite old men to be honest in terms of like the leading ones, to have that big turnaround to take part in those ones. And I think a little bit off back of probably some also the reports and concerns about why they sort of when they play competitive games or hear about like World Cups and the competitions there, it's probably about an unease about how seriously or too seriously do these other nations take football, which is in the British English mentality meant to be just a sport. It's obviously ironic in international. There's always going to be politics in international football because for me the clue is in the name, so to speak. But there's still that kind of conception, at least in Britain, that like politics should stay out of football. On the flip side of that, and this is sort of taken away from the World Cups, Britain is still connected in different ways with world football. So you have things like English referees are popular choices for international games across Europe. They go to the north and south of Ireland to referee league games because they're seen as like very good quality. They can be brought in. There won't be disputes about
Sir Stanley
favoritism.
Rouse himself is one of those.
Yes, and it's very interesting because I was looking through and compiling a list using other people's research on this from some of the referee websites on the internet. And funny enough, the country that Stanley Rouse refereed the most was Switzerland, if I got my fact right. Just funny, yeah. And so in that you can probably see him potentially creating some of those links with, like, some of the countries and areas France he went to as well, of him forming his own connections to leading officials that obviously would benefit both him because when he became FA secretary and then obviously president of FIFA. And most exotically, Isaac Caswell went to Argentina in the late 1930s. He was hired by the Argentinian FA to referee and demonstrate English refereeing techniques in Argentina. And that's a precursor to the post-war movement. There's about 50 odd British referees who went to Latin America, Central and South America between 1949 and 59. And then also, as Matthew Taylor's shown, British coaches are still popular around like Europe and other parts of the world. Maybe not in numerical terms as much. They didn't quite have the dominance as pre-First World War, but they are still there, quite important. The Football Museum, we've recently inducted Jack Greenwell, who was manager at Barcelona during the interwar period, played a role in keeping the club going during the Spanish Civil War. And British clubs tour, and also they invite continental European sides to come to Britain. So Austrian clubs are quite popular in terms of being invited across after Austria's played England in 1932, if I've got that right. So between 33 and 36. So it's one of these things when you delve into different areas or the broader picture, English football isn't as insulated as we might think from the big headlines of not competing in a World Cup or not taking part in playing certain games. But yeah, it's interesting.
Now, despite being out of these tournaments, there's still that feeling at home that internationally, England is still the best team in the world. Was this a prevalent feeling that led to the Battle of Highbury against defending World Cup champions Italy in November 1934?
Yeah, it's interesting sort of looking at the pattern of how England was inviting teams to come to England to play at the international level. So pre-First World War, haven't invited anyone at senior level. England has gone abroad a little bit. 20s, it's, as I say at the beginning, it's France and Belgium. That's more about almost like respecting your sort of wartime friendships and alliance. And then, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, Spain are the first to come, and that's the back of Spain becoming the first side to beat England in a match outside of England. Because obviously got the unbeaten home record, but as long as we don't count losing to the Scots, so it's a very interesting stat when we get to 53. It's like the unbeaten at home record. It's like, well, actually, how many games were there? It's very interesting. And so they beat Spain quite easily. Austria then also having at home, this is right. Then Austria have a good reputation rising up. Austria invited across. England beat them 4-3. The Austrians get a lot of respect for that. And then they've played Italy away in before the World Cup in 33 and drawn. I think is it 1-1. So then after Italy have won the World Cup, it's interesting because the FA invite Italy to come to them as opposed to Italy saying, can we come to you? Which is how it sometimes works with invitations to come to England. So yes, there's clearly this desire to sort of match themselves against the champions of the world. Also, it should be noted, obviously, they didn't do that with Uruguay in 30, but because of the distances of etc., a lot of issues there. That's probably why that didn't happen in terms of distance. So yeah, so they come across, and then obviously it turns into a quite heated battle because one of the Italian players is injured quite early on. England are 3-0 up, and then apparently the Italians take a bit of umbrage to think the injury is deliberate, and then start wading into the English players who pick up an assortment of different injuries themselves. It's a notable photograph of, I think I'm trying to remember if it's a Hapgood with like the plaster over his nose from where he's like had his nose smashed post the game. And so it kind of feeds into, and obviously a lot of sort of kind of xenophobic reporting around this in terms of stereotypes of Italians, references to the number of Italian like waiters coming who are living locally in London coming to the game, etc., etc. So it's this bit where sort of football does become this forum where I think it's not too long later on where it's the George Orwell quote about international football being war without the shooting, I think along those lines. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And that, to be honest, it's probably games like that and some of the reactions around that also potentially create a feeling, maybe with some FA officials, that some people, i.e. foreigners, take international football too seriously. And it's perhaps something we're better off out of playing it on our own terms when we choose, as opposed to being part of these tournaments, especially if there's like allegations around, as there were in 34, around match fixing in terms of referees siding with Italy, which is quite interesting.
As we get to the middle of the decade of the 1930s, political events take hold and there is the threat of a future war. There is an infamous match between England against Nazi Germany at White Hart Lane in 1935 that was controversial and led to many debates at the time. Can you discuss this and how this looming threat affected the game at home in any way?
Yeah, it's one thing I'd probably say before moving to it's interesting because it's essentially about the debate of like, should there be politics in sport? Can there be, isn't, or can you also, some ways, there's always going to be, so how can you choose to ignore it? And it's very interesting because the line taken by, say, like the FA, people are supportive of this. There's like, there shouldn't be politics in sport. We're inviting the Germans here as our guests. It's just a sporting bit, leave this politics out, that you can have the rest of the week for that. The British government did decide when sport and politics did intermix, because in 1930 they blocked the visit of a Soviet Russian side to take part in games with the British Communist-led Workers' Sports Federation, for example. So they could very much choose when, like, we're not going to have people in the country when this is like not appropriate politically wise, so to speak. And so obviously we're happy for the visits of sides from fascist-led countries such as Italy in 34 and Germany in 35. And so they lead to protests by Jewish and union groups who are opposed, obviously trying to raise the profile of what's wrong with fascist rule in Germany, how it affects people there. And on the counterpoint, you have the FA saying, and it's going to take part. It's also then expands because the Germans arranged for lots of fans to come across. So it's been used an element to show that this is the new German government, the new German people. They're coming across. Aren't they all well behaved? They're sort of hand selecting, making sure people come across, giving instructions about how to be guided. Don't talk about politics. And I think up to about 16,000 fans are coming across. And then obviously in the context of where people are debating, like, should we or should we not appease these countries? Do we want to run the risk of a future war generally? Is that obviously some people see, well, actually, this is a way to calm down these tensions between countries. Can sport be used to calm these? Can we see each other as like people without, the politics getting in the way? So some people also welcome the German fans when they come across, whether they're traveling across by ship or flying in. So there's a mixture of obviously how people are reacting and how they see their political connection to the understanding of this game. And you sort of see that there's anti-fascist protests, marches before the game takes place. And most famously, so that goes on within sort of like the ground. And famously, Ernie Woolley, who was a 24-year-old turner, sort of essentially working class background, he managed to cut down the flag, the German flag that was flying at the game, which would have had the swastika on. And so he was charged after the game with essentially for damage, to property, or to the tune of 3 shillings and 6pence. Although the case was dismissed because they're unable to produce the knife which the police had lost, and Spurs couldn't or weren't willing to say like exactly how much the flag cost. And obviously that's the broader context. They were choosing to have this game as well at White Hart Lane, at Tottenham Hotspur's ground, an area in a club connected with Jewish fans and Jewish life in North London. So again, that within all the debates and discussions added an extra layer to this about the politics of all. But at the end of the game, the FA was also sitting down and breaking bread and sort of having the talks after the game with their German counterparts, apologising for the protests and saying, these people are reflective of like the opinions and the feeling in this room where politics shouldn't be part of this. We welcome you to our country. And so they reflect these bigger, wider divides about how do we protest, do we not protest, how do we want to avoid the risk of a war. And you see that later on into the 30s where people are becoming aware, obviously, that if there's a war coming, it will probably be on the scale of the First World War. So in 1938, when there's the crisis over the annexation of the Czech Sudetenland, it takes place in September 38. So there's discussions about, will this affect, does football need to be stopped? Will it go ahead a bit like the First World War? In some ways, you start to see this this awareness of like the impact of another European or world war on football if it does come.
A few years later, as another war appeared more of a certainty, there is the infamous Nazi salute by the England team in 1938 in Berlin. How were these events debated at home?
I think it's quite interesting because, like, if you had something compiled today, you can imagine like how it would be off the radar in terms of media coverage, social media coverage. Obviously, what you have back then, it's mediated primarily through newspapers, so they're getting printed after the event. Going back, you've got a limited amount of newsreel. It takes place during the summer, so it's not during the main part of the football season. And again, it reflects these different divides. For some people, it's not a massive deal. To some people, it's just this like, this string, this thing you have to do when you go there. Do it out of politeness for your guests because that's what they ask you to do. Others see it like, it's something like others obviously do raise protests around it. It's not seen as appropriate. I think one example of sort of like how it, and also it should be stated also for quite a lot of probably some of the commentators and the press people, the result is the important thing. So beating the Germans in the football, but in the right way with an attacking display, that's seen as more important for national prestige, or at least football prestige, international football prestige, because that's showing that England is still like a top nation. It can go to other countries on their home turf and show them how the game should be played. So the salute is part of that broader dialogue, but it's not the only part of it. And by way of an example, it's sort of like one of the FA official, not too long ago, found a newspaper report from the Nottingham Press where they're interviewing one of the senior officials of the FA, who's also a local man, not FA, I think, official. And they ask him about the salute and they say, like, did you do it? And it's like, oh yes. And he gets up and gets up and demonstrates it because it's seen as this kind of a bit of a joke kind of thing to do, that he's happy enough to like do for a local reporter in his back garden, so to speak, or back at home. So it's interesting sort of like how that was seen. And then as the other challenges, obviously, like when you get to dissect the games, obviously understanding the players' reactions. And that's very hard because it's filtered through when they did talk about it. It was after the Second World War. So you've got a very big gap with a very big event in the between that's going to obviously potentially change how people remember it, discuss it. It's an interesting one. Like for just to give another example, is that if you go onto like say Twitter, you'll see a lot on every so often on this particular day about how Stan Cullis, the Wolves centre half at the time, part of the England squad and later famous manager at Wolves, was dropped from the England side for refusing to give the salute. It's the thing when you get into the contemporary news reports, he was not selected, wasn't going to be selected to start because they'd announced the team, they always did, some time in advance, and he'd been put down as a reserve because his form was probably not felt to be good enough to be a first team starter. So he was never going to start, not unless someone had got injured on the day and there's no reports of that or any last minute changes. I think it's something that's come through sort of like the family talking about it later. And so he may well have obviously expressed unease or unhappiness about it or the unwillingness to do it at any point or form. Obviously we don't have any photographs of like the reserve players, the other players outside of, we only see the players on the pitch. But it's an example, you now go to Twitter and like it's established, you have like Twitter accounts with like tens of thousands of people following where they will put that out as fact and people who engage with it as fact. When you actually get into the contemporary sources for it, you can make an argument for it. Obviously certain parts of that are not correct and other parts are open to debate at best. So it's very interesting, obviously, how this match is seen and continues to change and be seen over time because it's people like to have a sort of positive message out of what is obviously a very controversial and arguably like the most shameful moment in English international football, really.
As the war started, football had to stop once more. I imagine since this was not an uncharted territory, the reaction was different from 1914.
Yes, in 1914, they had to make a choice about whether the season was to go ahead. In 1939, the season's already underway, but they kind of almost like, in a way, learn their lesson from the First World War. They stop it straight away, they avoid any criticism or major criticism, and then they restart it after appropriate discussions with the government and with changed wartime rules, similar to the First World War. And so that allows essentially sort of for it to have a good war where it's seen as like properly part in spirit, fully in line with like wartime spirit, especially like in terms of way the government wants to encourage sport. There's a great understanding as well by the Second World War of total war involves supporting the civilian and the military population at home, not just abroad on active service. And so it requires things like leisure activities to give people both a relief from war, but also a sense of why you're fighting a war, because these are the things that are define Englishness, like the ability to go and play football, to go down to the park, to watch football, to go down to the park, to play football, to read about it, or to do other activities like sporting or leisure ones. And then also crucially into Stanley Rouse, they've got an official who knows, who's learned those lessons and also is very connected to a lot of people at sort of government and voluntary organisations. And so he again makes sure football gets co-opted or has a place within those. So an example of that is players quickly have the chance to become physical instructors in the armed forces, because it's a way to like say, here are footballers, they've got a skill set, use it, don't just plonk them in like, square pegs and round holes, make the best use of them, especially if they've got they're known people, they can show other people that footballers are doing, contributing.
What were the innovations, say, in terms of tactics or press coverage or anything else of these interwar years?
From my sort of the ones I was just thinking about, key ones in terms of the playing game is obviously you have the offside law changes in the 20s. And then the creation of WM formation that comes out of it, which involves basically dropping one of your midfielders back into defence to have three at the back instead of two. That's obviously these are changes that not affect not just English and British football, but world football as well. Because obviously these are law essentially become the laws of the games that are passed on around the world. And the WM formation remains a key part of of English football through into post World War II period. Connected to that, the game is speeding up, or that's what was helping speed up the game, especially around once the offside law is gone. And you have the diagonal line system of refereeing introduced in the 1930s, which was, I think, first potentially used abroad in Central Europe, but Stanley Rouse in England is quite a key figure in getting it popularised, especially when he became Secretary of the FA. And that's the system of basically where you should have the referee in the middle and one linesman roughly in line with the defences on either side to be able to make the call, to have an in-line call. And that comes out partly over the controversy of the 1932 FA Cup final, of the ball over the line final, as it was, when Newcastle United scored a controversial equaliser against Arsenal, where the ball may or may not been out of play. I am for obviously, you must hold up my hands here. I'm a Newcastle United fan. I've looked at the photographs. I've read all the reports and different things. I'm not entirely sure whether the ball was fully over the line or not. And obviously, we must know that all of the ball must cross the line. And obviously, it's not like there's been recent controversy involving a ball over the line at a Newcastle Arsenal game in this last season at all either. So couldn't possibly comment on that one at all. We've also got the development of American style sports writing in the national press. So it's moving more away from a kind of sort of Edwardian, Victorian, quite sort of formal, very long, verbose style to more punchy, short, opinion-led, looking for controversy. You see that particularly in newspapers like The People, but also like the Daily Mirror. And then, as you've mentioned before, so radio coverage coming in, becoming a key part of that growing media world where you can consume football. Shirt numbers at the very end of the interwar period come in as well, and they come across the 30s. And in some ways, also you can argue like you start to see officials and teams start to use the aeroplane to travel a further afield for games. It's big, obviously making that football world smaller in terms of like how you can get to games and take part. So some British referees are involved in like refereeing games in the Mitropa Cup, which is a forerunner of the European Cup in that period. So it's again interesting sort of see officials get into that. One of the British refs who was quite popular with international games for some of those club sides was known as the Flying Ref, because that's how he got to all of his games in Europe and midweek and then back for like his work day. So it's interesting that when you get into this, there's quite a lot of, while some things remain, the broader picture is remaining quite static, there's lots of interesting different changes and developments going on that makes it a period of a lot more change than perhaps is first imagined, I think. You've had the ban on women's football, which is terrible. I mentioned this earlier. In essence, you could have had a greater expansion of the game to allow women to play, to have women's teams, to have leagues, cups, all sorts, because they were there emerging from the First World War and in the early 20s. But then it's essentially kneecapped by the FA by not allowing them to play on their club, on the FA affiliated club grounds. At the same time, women's football does continue, it does take part, and there's more and more research being done on that 20s and 30s of how women's football teams were playing despite the ban. They were going abroad to different countries like Spain and France and the States with teams like Dick Kerr's ladies. And so in essence, there's that hidden history there that is still being uncovered and researched. So that's less so much of an innovation as the biggest backward step that takes place in that period, but also that continues into the 40s and 50s and 60s as well.
Are these interwarriors in any way looked upon as halcyon days of English football?
I think it's one of those ones like nostalgia tends to work in the glorious past is somewhere about 20 to 30, maybe 40, 50 years beforehand. You might have living memory of it. It may be just outside of living memory in some ways. if you read press reports of the interwar period, you hear complaints about football. It's too fast, it's too skillful, it's not skillful enough, it's too full of fouls, stoppages, too many offsides, especially pre the offside law change. It's too commercialized, there's too much gambling, the pools is a negative impact on society and life. Dictatorships and other sometimes other foreign countries take sport far too seriously, especially international realm. It's not meant to be for the things like this. And so I think at any one time you can always see you if you read the contemporary reports, there's always sorts of concerns about the game is bad in this different way, and it's like that. At the same time, they recognised that it was hugely popular, the crowds were growing for most of this period, that you would have within that still a lot of great football being played that could be enjoyed, great stars that you could go enjoy watching, like when Eddie Matthews, Stan Matthews coming through in the 30s. I think it's again sort of very much sort of like it is a nostalgic thing. Does tend to be sort of people always like they will look at to the past to reflect in relation to their concerns of that moment and sometimes reinterpret the past accordingly, which may not fit with the actual historical picture for that picture 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that people are talking about. I mean, it's interesting, yeah. Sort of like in terms of international football, they lost to Scotland quite a good chunk of the period. So in some ways, it can't be in a halcyon era. Although halcyon era probably going for the Scots, especially with the I think they're pretty keen on that 5-1 victory at Wembley, I believe.
In closing, as we come to 1939, how would you describe the evolution of the game culturally and socially in these 20 years from the end of the Great War?
Culturally and socially, in terms of women's football, it's this huge backward step, or rather, it's very much drawing a line in the sand and trying to allow creating a wall, trying to keep it there. In terms of that, women were played a little bit before the First World War, starting to come through. The First World War had shown the potential for women's football in the early 20s, and that if women's football had been allowed to develop, even within its own, without necessarily massive support, it could have been a wholly different picture. And we sometimes have to look to like female engagement in other sports where they were allowed to take part, was seen as appropriate to see like what you could have, like big crowds for like women's hockey, for example. So that's a very socially conservative, repressive part of the picture there. And I think it's probably important to foreground, especially because I haven't talked about it too much earlier. In terms of the men's game, it's this broadly sort of continuous growth. It's in some ways might be seen quite static, sharing a lot in terms of the post pre-First World War and post Second World War of this flat cap image, large crowds, mainly men on these terraces in terms of spectatorship. And in some ways, that's quite true. The stadium remains relatively the same. You have some developments, but it's still got a lot going back to the Edwardian period. But then, if you dig deeper, like we've been discussing in some of the questions earlier, in some of the detail, you can see officials, administrators, players, referees, and others engaging with new technologies, being introduced to things like radios and aeroplanes, like international football on a different scale, or in different parts of the world. And for some, there is that interest, there is that desire to be more connected with it and to introduce certain types of change, whether it be numbers, the offside law, that build up towards. I think you're having a lot of the seeds sown for some of the bigger transformations that you perhaps see in the 1950s and into the 60s. It's always that challenge of how much continuity and change do you have in any one period that historians love sort of debating. So for me, it's like sort of that broader perhaps stereotype is a little bit true, but at the same time, when to get into that detail, it is really fascinating and digging down into it. It sometimes I think there's a lot more nuance there than perhaps some people imagine. And for me, I find it a really fascinating period. I think in some ways it's still relatively underexplored compared to the ones, and there's a lot more to it that can aid our understanding of both what came before and what came after, particularly.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information, including the link to Mr. Jackson's book, is listed on the blog and podcast listings. So, Alex, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to be on the show again. Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.